Well, good morning, everyone. We're glad to be joining you here from the KanREN office and conducting one of the first webinars that we have presented via Zoom, which is a video collaboration tool that we use and that a number of our members also use. I'd like to welcome you to Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards webinar. This is an awareness session in hopes of bringing some attention and to build understanding around what the PCI data security standards are and how those affect us that work in the IT environment. My name is Melinda Stanley, and I am with KanREN. I joined the KanREN team in early August after being an IT director at Lawrence Public Schools for a while, and then before that I was at the State Department of Education for 10 years as the State Ed Tech coordinator, working with districts on technology planning, broadband connectivity, E-rate, and some of those types of things. So it's a pleasure to be with everyone. We have two members that have volunteered to share their expertise with you today around this topic. And I hope this is the first of a number of opportunities that we'll have to have members share and for us all to learn together. So I'd like to introduce our two presenters today, which are Amanda Williams, who works at Pittsburgh State University. Amanda is the Information Security Officer at Pittsburgh. And Elizabeth Shannon is also joining us from Manhattan. She is at Kansas State University as their Information and Security Manager. So welcome both of our presenters, and we appreciate you sharing your expertise with everyone today. All right, just a few logistics to cover for today. We are doing this in a webinar fashion, so we have approximately 30 folks that will be joining in the webinar remotely, and we will be presenting information on slides, which we will post at kanren.net after our webinar ends. We have a number of folks that are joining us from around the state, so we want to welcome both our members and our non-members who may be joining us. And as part of the process for our participants, there is a Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window, and that's how we would like for you to submit questions. Please feel free to submit questions during the presentation, and because we want to make sure we capture all of those. So then we will address those at the end of the presentation with the presenters. So hopefully we would love your feedback on how this goes for you as well. So we look forward to hearing your feedback. So with that, I'll transition us into our topic. One of the things that this was a topic that became kind of a surprise to me. As an IT director, we had disparate payment systems and different silos of folks that took payments. And I had a colleague who asked me, he worked for a company here in Lawrence, and he said, "How are you guys managing PCI compliance?" And I said, "I don't know what that is." So it was a new thing for me, and I thought I hadn't heard of it from our business and operations side, and I thought, you know, this may be a topic that some other technology directors in school districts or even in other similarly situated types of institutions are kind of flying under the radar about. So after kind of checking with other people and checking into it, I thought, holy smokes, I felt a little behind the 8 ball and thought this was it could potentially be a liability, especially when we're seeing all these data breach types of headlines, and people are making the news, and I'm getting a new credit card in the mail because something had been compromised for my account at my bank. And so in light of all of this, I thought, well, let's try to do an awareness workshop to see, how other people are addressing PCI compliance and making sure that people are aware and have some of those types of conversations. So the session today is really intended to be an awareness webinar, and we can, based on what folks need and really your feedback, we can try to continue to meet those needs if we need to dig deeper or offer other things. So with that, I would turn it over to Amanda, and Amanda will give you kind of the basic overview of PCI data security standards. So Amanda, I will stop sharing and send it your way.
All right, thank you. There we go. Okay, is it okay, I hope? All right, so the PCI DSS, it stands for your Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. This is an industry standard that is regulated by the 5 major credit card brands, and it is to ensure that all companies that process, store, or transmit cardholder data do so in a secure environment. Is a global security standard that applies to any business of any size that process, stores, or transmit cardholder data. And the one thing that I always stress at PSU is that this is not enforced or regulated by the state of Kansas, but this is an industry standard we have to follow in order to take credit cards. It consists of 6 goals and 12 requirements, and I am not going to sit here and they will be in the slides that Melinda sends out. The purpose of it is really pretty simple. It is to promote consistent global security standards that protects cardholder fraud and or security breach. So what's covered in the PCI DSS? You're going to hear this term a lot, is cardholder data. That is your full primary account number or the full account number with the cardholder name, the expiration date, or the security code. There's also sensitive data, and that is your magnetic stripe data, your CVV, and your PIN. And that information is something that you should never anywhere, ever. So there's the PCI Security Standards Council, and they develop, maintain, and manage the PCI security standards. They are working to educate and promote awareness of the need for payment data security. The thing to remember about them is that they are not validating or enforcing compliance, but really they are a centralized resource for access to the standards and any certified services that you need to be compliant. If you plan to hire a QSA, which is a certified security assessor, that's somebody that will come to your location and do a gap analysis and help kind of lay out a roadmap for your compliance. Those people need to be certified through the council, and the same with penetration testing. They need to be done by an approved scanning vendor. So all of those services have to be approved by the Security Council. So the process looks pretty simple. You're going to assess, remediate, report, and then you're going to repeat. You're going to assess your technology and processes for vulnerabilities that pose a risk to the security of your cardholder data. The one thing that you need to remember as you're assessing your processes is that if you have third parties that are doing all of your credit card processing, so you think, oh, I'm outsourcing this, so this doesn't apply to me, it still does. You are still responsible for PCI compliance and making sure companies and businesses that you do business with are also PCI compliant. And then you're going to remediate those security vulnerabilities, and then report your compliance to your acquiring bank. And then this is an ongoing process. This process is something that you will continually do. The PCSS is an ever-changing document, just like technology changes. I mean, the document has to keep up with technology. It's always going to be changing, and you're going to have to meet new requirements and have new things that you're going to have to do. All right. So part of the reporting process is the SAQ, and that stands for your self-assessment questionnaire. As you can see, there are different questionnaires, and depending on your interaction with cardholder data will depend on which questionnaire that you fill out. The questionnaires range from 13 questions to over 280 questions. So one of the things that we at Pitt State is really try to reduce our scope and kind of where that cardholder data is being transmitted and processed and stored. We've been able to install encrypted card readers at several of our locations. And then we've also worked very closely with our food service provider and our ticket office. Those are our two biggie locations that are kind of doing their own thing. So we really needed to make sure that what they were doing properly. So the costs of being non-compliant or having a breach, there are fines, lawsuits, investigations, and then you have the costs of notification, credit monitoring, and recarding your constituents if you do have a. And I think for us, the biggie is that loss of reputation and customer confidence. That's just a, you know, I don't think it's probably stopped shop Target or Home Depot after their credit card breaches in the news. But I think somebody might think twice about maybe, you know, if your kids are attending college somewhere and they can't keep your data safe, you know, are they going to be able to keep my kids safe? So I think that loss of reputation and customer confidence is a huge one for us. And then ultimately you could lose the ability to accept payments. So if you are currently taking cards, or if you're thinking cards, PCI DSS applies to you, because anyone involved in any process must understand and follow the PCI DSS. So thank you. I have included some links to the Security Council website and then the credit card brands, and those will be included in the guide. So with that, I will turn over to Elizabeth.
And as Elizabeth gets queued up here, I will just briefly remind folks that we will be posting everyone's presentation and the resources so that you have those to refer back to. And Elizabeth, are you ready? I think you may still be muted.
Yeah, I just unmuted.
There we go. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I was already, as we're going to be hearing me. Okay, Amanda laid a great groundwork for the PCI and kind of what happens and kind of where that comes from and kind of the history of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, you hear terms such as merchant and service provider. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is a merchant, and I will let you guys read that. That's what most of you are going to be considered is a merchant. So basically you're accepting some type of credit card for goods or services. And then the merchant identification number, you will hear that referred to as a MID. That is assigned to you by your acquiring bank, and it is one of the things that is used to identify the merchant. The thing is that at K-State, we have about 50 merchant IDs, and those are not unique to a department. We have some departments that have multiple merchant IDs, and that kind of has to do with your business office and how they are going to assign those out to the departments. Merchant levels, they're 1 through 4. The thing, if you are a level 1 or level 2 merchant, you already know a lot about PCI, and there isn't anything that that I'm probably going to be able to share with you that you don't already know. So most of you are either going to be considered level 3 or level 4, and that is based on the number of transactions that you process annually. So if you process 20,000 to 1 million transactions, you are going to be a level 3 merchant provider. And that is all of your transactions. So that means if you're running e-commerce, if you're running card swipe, anything that you're using where your merchant ID is processing credit card transactions, that's what determines what your level is. I was kind of looking at the list of people that were attending today, and I noticed there's probably some of those you are probably small enough to be considered a level 4 merchant. Okay, and in this particular thing, being considered a level 4 merchant is not a bad thing at all. So level 3 and level 4 merchants are able to do a self-assessment questionnaire, and that is something that you need to do annually, and you go through, and as Amanda mentioned earlier, the self-assessment questionnaires, it depends on how you take transactions. And it started at A and went all the way to, there's like D, and then there's different levels in there. So A is going to be something that is very, very small. I don't know that we really have very many people that qualify for an SAQ-A, but an SAQ-B are people that are running credit cards over a card swipe or a card terminal, and it's phone-based. And those are the ones that I absolutely love, because the number of questions that we have to ask that department and the number of things that's required for them to show that they are compliant with the standard, very, very minimal. So that is a good thing from my perspective, and I always am very happy when I get to say, hey, you're an SAQ-B. So from a service provider's perspective, you hopefully only have service providers that are service providers for you. Hopefully you don't have that you're not being a service provider for anyone. So that is basically someone that is involved in the processing, storage, or transmission of cardholder data on behalf of another entity. And the thing here that you need, one of the first questions I always ask about a service provider is who owns that MID, or who owns that merchant ID? Because if it is a K-State merchant ID that's being used and somebody is being on K-State's behalf, then they are a service provider for us, and there are certain things that are required. Now, if the merchant ID that's being used is the service provider's, then that transfers almost all of the risk, not all of it, but most of it, to that service provider. Because if there is a breach, it doesn't go against your merchant ID, it goes against their merchant ID. And so that's whenever the fines come in, the increase in what it is that you have to do about being a level, because if you have a breach, you are going to move, if you're a level 4 or a level 3 or level 2, you're going to move to a level 1, and that's forensic analysis and on-site assessments, and it gets very, very expensive. So you do not want to have a breach and have to move up into that. So that's always my first question is, who owns that merchant ID? The second thing is I'll give you an example of really, in all honesty, when we were going through our PCI compliance, and they started at K-State before I arrived. They kind of started in 2010. They were notified by their acquiring bank and said, hey, we want to see your SAQs. And K-State was kind of like, oh, okay, we'll get right on that. So what we had, and there may be other individuals out there that are in the same situation, you have a food service provider for either your campus, your hospital, something that is not under, they have their own merchant ID. And so let's pick on Sodexo as one of those. So Sodexo may be your food service provider, and they're coming in and they are providing the food services. They're using their own merchant ID. And one of the ways that you may be allowing them to run, you may be providing the equipment, or they may be providing their own equipment, but it's running across your network. And so that is the thing that you really need to understand. If you are providing the network connectivity for them, if you own the point of sale systems, if you manage the servers that are like Micros is one of the software that can be used to do that. If you are providing all of that for them, then you are a service provider for that food service vendor. And one of the ways that we handled this was we said, okay, we are no longer going to do that. You need to isolate your traffic The equipment we will not manage for you. We will not manage that server. We will not do anything. You need to treat us just exactly like you would another ISP and treat our network as hostile. And so then that puts them on the hook for all the PCI compliance requirements. Because if you don't do that, then at this next, continuing on with the slide, you've got a level 1 or level 2 service providers. So a level 1 service provider is someone that stores, processes, or transmits over 300,000 transactions. So if you think of your food service vendor and the food court and different ways that they're doing that, if they're running the convenience store, lots of different things like that, it doesn't take that long annually before you may be considered a level 1 service provider. And if you are, that means that you cannot self-assess. You have to have someone come on site and do all of that for you, and you're going to have to hire that out. A rough estimate that I had heard whenever I was kind of inquiring into this is that it would have cost K-State about $100,000 annually to go through that entire process and do everything that was needed. Now, you can have a level 2 service provider, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not as good as a level 1. It just means that those number of transactions is less than 300,000 annually. So the thing there is that they can self-assess. The other example I kind of wanted to use of a service provider is they're referred to as a nested service provider. And I have an example of that. So we have a registration system, and it's out in the cloud, so it's hosted by somebody else, but it's using a K-State merchant ID. And then they may not be the payment processor. So you're working with the cloud vendor for your registration system, and then you've got a payment processor. And so you go through that, and it may be a payment processor that you're familiar with, like Authorize.net. In our case, we use CashNet. There could be Nelnet, TouchNet, all of those different things. And you may already be aware of that, and that may end up using your merchant ID. It could be that the software that's hosted in the cloud, so you're working with this vendor, and the vendor says, oh, okay, we've got this in the cloud, and we're using like Amazon Web Services, and that's where the servers actually reside, and then it goes on to your payment processor. Many of the vendors do not understand, one, that they are a service provider. They are hosting that software on your behalf because you are paying them. Their staff are managing that, updating it, all of that, and then they are the people that are responsible for doing that redirect out to the payment processor. I've had quite a few vendors that I've had to work with directly, and they say, no, we're not considered a service provider. And I said, yes, you are, because you manage that on our behalf, and then you're doing a redirect out there. So that's an example of a nested service provider. And what you need to do is you need to follow that all the way through that chain. So you work with your vendor. If they're going out to Amazon Web Services, you need to also check on that and make sure your contract with Amazon, but that is part of your vendor agreements, and then whoever that processor is. So you may have multiple venues that you need to check and document, and that is something that is new in 3.0, 3.1 is that now an agreement between your service provider and you is required, and it needs to be in writing and it states who is responsible for what. And the other thing that you need to have is contract language with every one of your service providers, and that is something that if you have an existing contract, you need to make sure that you've got an addendum to that contract that states who is going to be responsible. And we have one of those, and basically what we do is if we say that if it's the service provider, that they're basically on the hook. If whenever the forensics are done and it comes back that the report is that the vendor is responsible for that breach, then they are going to be responsible for any fines, any forensic work, so on and so forth. Now, as Amanda mentioned, that isn't necessarily going to help you from a brand perspective, but with all the budget shortfalls, it's at least it's kind of nice to be able to say we can handle the brand stuff, but we're not going to have to take on those additional fines and any fallout from that. So those are two really important things there. And we have done everything that we can to not be considered a service provider. And that has been, I think, very successful for us. But that is one of the things that you want to make sure that you are not a service provider. So that brings up, and Amanda mentioned this about the cardholder data environment. So basically, it's anything that's involved in that storing process or transmitting cardholder data or that sensitive authentication data. And the security requirements apply to everything that's included in or connected to the cardholder data environment. As you'll note down there at the bottom, if you're not familiar with the PCI DSS, the Requirements and Security Assessments Procedure, version 3.1, you can just Google that, go out there, and it'll take you right to the document. It's a very handy document. It's what allows you to help with the assessment and gives you guidance on that. But page 10 is a lot of the information that I'm going to cover. And that is something that when I was working with our acquiring bank, they had resources, PCI resources available for us to use, and they kept going back to page 10 a lot. And it's one that I've had to use a lot with vendors to point out things and go to page 10 on this, read to this, and explain things to them. So, so the system components, I'll let you read this. This is something that really isn't new, but for a lot of people that have maybe been doing PCI for a while, the web is something web servers that's really big for them. But if you look at this, you start thinking, oh my gosh, there's a lot of things here. The other thing is your applications. So anything that's involved in this processing, transmitting, or storing of credit card data, it's included in that. And the thing is that if you're doing custom application, there's an entire section in PCI that's required, and it is very lengthy, and it can be pretty involved as far as being able to comply with that. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that there are many applications that are PCI compliant. They are certified. You can go out to the Security Council's website. You can see those. They'll tell you what version is compliant with the standard. But one of the things that we ran into was we had an application here, and we were working with the third party to have it installed. And there's an entire manual that they have to produce to say, okay, it has to be installed in this manner for it to be PCI compliant. So just because you buy a PCI compliant application, if it's not installed properly and configured and updated, you may have an application that doesn't meet the standard. It's not that the application isn't compliant, it's because of the implementation does not follow the guidelines that it needs to. So that's something that I think is very important to note. The other thing is, as more and more people go to virtualization, that was the other thing that we ran into here is that can potentially fall into your environment. So that could be virtual switch and routers, appliances, hypervisors. A lot of people don't want to think that hypervisor is included in that, but it is. It's everything in that environment. The other thing that you have to consider is you've got network components like firewalls, switches, routers, wireless access points, any type of other security appliances. So as you start looking at this, and as I've talked to many departments across campus, IT departments, they immediately start saying, well, it sounds like everything in the world that we touch or do because we take credit cards at K-State is now going to be in scope. And that's one of the things that, as Amanda mentioned earlier, that you want to try to reduce that scope. Anything that's going to provide security services, those are also going to be in scope. And then the last statement is anything else that's included in there that's connected or located within the cardholder data environment is also. So basically they pretty much say everything that's involved in processing, storing, or transmitting credit cards connected to, it's all in scope. So what we want to talk about here is those in-scope systems, because really what you want to do is have that very, very small and have the other things that are out of scope, the entire rest of your network. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to identify everything that's involved in that, and you want to identify all the locations and flow of cardholder data. So you need to think about, like we're kind of thinking, we're talking technology here, but what about those paper processes? that come in, because oftentimes people use campus mail to submit or receive those credit cards. Like somebody fills out a form and it's got credit card information, they dump that into campus mail and they send it to the business office, or they send it to foundation or alumni or something like that. So those paper processes and all of that needs to be looked at and considered when you're looking at that. So it's not just electronic. And that's one of the things that we probably had a large number of people initially that were storing paper records. And they were saying that they needed to do that for audit purposes, or they needed to hold on to this information until they were able, like for ticketing. So they may submit those, people may mail those in, and they need to be held on so they can give them their tickets or whatever. So we kind of talked about ways that they could revise forms, or the way that they needed to protect those paper documents. So really what you're going to look at is anything that could potentially affect that security of the cardholder data environment. Those are things that you really want to hone in on. So one of the easiest ways to make things out of scope is to utilize network segmentation to isolate or control that access to the rest of the network. And the key here is that even if one of those systems that's out of scope was compromised, it's not going to impact the security of your cardholder data environment. So think of it this way: if you have somebody in the business office and they have a dedicated workstation where they're entering credit card payments or something along those lines, that if a lab machine was compromised, malware or something along those lines, it could not affect that person in the cashier's office that are entering in those credit card transactions. So if you have a flat network, which hopefully many of you don't, that you want to move away from that flat network, at least for your credit card holder data environment. And one of the things that we've done, we basically created what we call CCNet, credit card network, and that's where we have identified our servers, anything that has to do with credit card processing, and we've put those behind a dedicated PCI firewall. So one of the easiest ways to look at this, it's called the Open Scoping Resource Toolkit, and there's a link to it at the end of this presentation. But whenever I start talking to people, they immediately get concerned and they're like, everything on our campus, everything on the internet, everything has to be in scope for PCI. And it's like, no, let's sit down and talk about this. So you have Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3 devices. So your Category 1 are those things that are involved in actually that credit card transmission. And remember, it can be the actual device, and it can be everything along the network that's included in that. And then you've got these Category 2 devices. Those are things that have controlled access to those Category 1 devices. And then Category 3 is everything else. So in here, and I've already mentioned this, that basically if you have a flat network and everything can talk to a Category 1 device, then everything in your network is considered in scope for PCI. Because everything that's a Category 1 is always in scope for PCI. So your Category 2, let me back up just a second. I was going to give an example of a Category 1 device. This would be something like, I call it a card swipe, but the business people call them a terminal. So something, and that's something that makes sense to us. We're used to people walking up, swiping, and we understand that that is involved in that. Something else it will be is if you provide a walk-up kiosk, like in the cashier's office, we have one, so that the students can go over and they can make credit card payments for that. So a Category 2 device is something, they're not involved in that processing, storage, or transmission of the cardholder data, but it says controlled access to a Category 1, or it's used to support that. So for us, a Category 2 device is outside of our credit card network, So it has to have access, so it goes through our PCI firewall. So that basically it has controlled access through the PCI firewall, and it's limited to just what is required for business operations. So it is a very tightly monitored firewall that only certain things are allowed in and out of that, IP addresses, that sort of thing. And then also, as you'll notice, it needs to be justified and documented. Unfortunately, in one of our older applications that we no longer have, NetBIOS, which is an insecure protocol, was required for this application to work. If you turned off NetBIOS or you didn't allow it, then the application stopped working. And that was for a parking garage. So, making the arm go up and down, being able to receive payments, that was kind of important. So there was no way around it. This was the application. It was required. So we had to write on there, the reason that we are allowing NetBIOS was that if we don't, then the application doesn't work. So it's justified, it's documented, and we're restricting how that can get access to that. One of the other things is your antivirus would be an example of this. So they're going to be in the scope of the assessment also. And you basically have to protect, you have to document that you've adequately protected the Category 2, so that if one of your Category 3 is impacted or affected in some way from malicious software or something like that, so they can't be used as an attack vector. So Category 2 devices, you have to harden them. You have to do certain things to them, but basically you're trying to make sure that they can't be used to compromise something in the cardholder data environment. An example of a Category 3 system component would be like our Nagios, our monitoring. So the Nagios doesn't have, it's not processing, storing, or transmitting cardholder data. It's isolated from my kiosk. And actually what Nagios is doing, since it doesn't have direct access to the Category 1, because we're not monitoring those devices in there, we may be monitoring other devices, other Category 2 devices, or other things across campus. That makes it a Category 3. And the reason that I really like using Category 1, Category 2 devices is that whenever I draw lots of pictures for people, and I'm like, okay, tell me how this works, show me how this, and so that we start drawing pictures, and I'm like, okay, so this is the Category 1, and they usually agree with that. Category 2, and I'm like, okay, what is it that's going to need to talk directly to that thing that's in Category 1, and then we move to Category 3, and I'm like, okay, can it talk to, does it need to? And sometimes you need to kind of change things. We had DHCP, and our DHCP servers are very ancient and very old, and there was no way that they could be hardened. So what we did, it's not necessarily a best practice, but we really didn't have any way around that, was rather than our DHCP servers be in scope for PCI as a Category 2 device, we just hard-coded those IP addresses and those devices that we did have out across campus. And we don't have that many, so it was doable for us. So this is kind of the thing that I wanted to, this I think kind of summarizes it really nicely, and this is the picture that I'm talking about. Like our Category 1, what we have here at K-State is we have kiosks, basically things that people can walk up, systems they can walk up to, and they can enter in their own credit card information. We have workstations, and that may be something that somebody is sending in a paper copy, or they're calling in that information. And so you have to have a dedicated workstation that can only be used to process those credit card transactions. The other thing is your e-commerce web server. So if you have a web server that is doing a redirect on your campus, that web server falls into scope, and it is considered a Category 1, because it may not be accepting those credit card transactions, but it's doing some type of a redirect. And if that web server is compromised, and they can capture that information, they can do a redirect of where somebody enters in the credit card information and it kicks back an error and it says, oh, that wasn't the right one. And it may be that they captured it and then they enter it again, and the next time it goes through. And so the user may be thinking, oh, I just typed it in wrong. There's a problem there. Your point of sale systems, like in a bookstore, or it could be food service or something along those lines. Anything where you're using a point of sale and they're using credit card data, you want to make sure that that system, you need to be real careful, and you need to understand exactly how that card data is flowing through that. Your switches and your routers and your card swipes. Now, switches and routers, and we had a big discussion about this with my networking people. They said, but the credit card data is encrypted. Well, that's encrypted. And I'm like, okay, there is a big difference in PCI about encryption. Okay. Between the transport, which SSL, TLS, hopefully is TLS 1.2 now, that the transport is what's encrypted. The data that's flowing through that is not encrypted. So for something not to be considered in scope, the actual credit card data needs to be encrypted. And as Amanda pointed out, that they've got several implementations at Pittsburgh State of where it's kind of called a point-to-point encryption. So they swipe it, it's encrypted maybe at the read head, at the device, and it's encrypted there. And then it goes all the way out to the processor before it's decrypted. So if you've got that type of credit card transactions going on, then your switchers and your routers, other firewalls, those would not be considered in scope. But unfortunately here at K-State, we do have people that are entering in credit cards. It's basically our kiosk and our workstations where we have people that are entering in credit card information. So we do have switches and routers on our campus that fall into scope for PCI. So then we've got our Category 2 devices. And those are like our domain controllers, our AV, vulnerability scanners. You've got to be keeping logs, so those are going to fall into scope. You've got load balancers such as an F5. Those may be in scope for you, NTP, DNS. So those are all things that fall into scope for PCI, and we have to do certain things with those. And then we've got our Category 3 devices, which are our monitoring services, our lab computers, other web servers, databases, anything else, and that's all out of scope. And this is not a non-trivial thing. The other thing that's really important is, and this diagram does not, sorry about that, does not depict this, but something that's new in 3.0, 3.1 is that you need to have data flow diagrams. And so you really need to think about diagramming that all the way through, of where if you've got somebody that's off campus, somebody that's on campus, and all of the different systems that's flowing through, anything that's connected to that, so that you can really look at that, and that's going to give you the best idea of helping you define what's in that cardholder data environment. Here's some examples, some resources that I've used in the past, and I know that we've got some duplicates there. So my contact information is there. We're getting ready. Coalfire is the qualified security systems company that we're working with, and they're actually going to be on site for us next week, meeting with all of our departments that we've identified that take credit cards, and we're going to be coming up with that gap analysis. So it'll be really interesting for us to find out kind of where we're at and where Coalfire tells us that we need to be, and hopefully there's not a lot of gaps there, a lot of surprises. They have kind of already let us know that many universities think that they've got a really good handle on this, and then there's these little gotchas out there that they weren't even aware of. So with that, I will turn it back over to Melinda.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. I think you guys have outlined it very clearly, and it's not an easy thing to clearly outline. So with that, I'd like to address a few questions to the panelists that we've received. One of the questions was whether the transaction counts were monthly or annually, and those, I believe, are annually based on your calendar year. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from a public library, says we use Square to process in-person fines and PayPal to process our web fines. We do not have an acquiring bank. Do using these vendors relieve us of compliance issues? Elizabeth, can you take that one?
Okay, in both of those, like with Square, you don't have a merchant ID. They're handling all that for you. And it sounds like maybe you're doing the same thing with PayPal. But I would verify that for your PayPal. Square is not an approved device to be using for credit cards. Now, there are a few out there, but Square is not one of them. Are a lot of people using them? Yes. But one of the things that we have at K-State is we do not allow anything that has not been approved by the PCI Council to be used to process credit card transactions. One of the things that I would look at is depending on if you're using Square, and Melinda, if you could maybe possibly, if they could answer this, what kind of device are they using? Is this running across your network, and is that's segregated, or are they using a phone? And is that a dedicated device to do that? Because if it's not a dedicated device, then, and that can be used for other things, that system can be compromised, and you may not be aware that credit card data is being captured on that device. So yes, really you are in scope because you are taking credit cards and getting payments for those. And even though you don't have a merchant ID, there is going to be, as Amanda said, there's a relationship or an image or a brand impact there. But I would be very, very careful, and I would still at least be looking at the SAQs, and you could probably fill out something that's pretty minor for that. Vendors are pretty notorious for saying, oh, we take you completely out. Your scope is completely gone if you'll just use our services.
So just a quick follow-up to that, Elizabeth, is there was a response saying that they're using an iPad through their wireless network for Square.
Okay. The thing is that depending, it's been a while since I have read anything on Square, partly because we don't allow those here at K-State. But it was my understanding, and it may depend on the version, what is happening is, you put that dongle in the microphone, and if it's not being encrypted, the credit card data is not being encrypted by that device, it may be just using SSL all the way out to the processor, which means you're using your wireless, which means your wireless is now in scope. And the other thing is if it's using the iPad to encrypt it, that iPad that could potentially have malware is also in for PCI. So it really kind of depends on the device and what version it is that you're using. Because I have read that some of the later ones do encrypt, but that's the important thing is, where is it encrypting that credit card data at?
Thank you. Now, another question about end user computers. What about end user computers? We have no way to monitor whether they have been compromised.
Okay, do you want me to take a stab at answering that one also?
You bet.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
I hear this question a lot. People are like, because the kind of differences between end users, okay? Like the people at home that may be paying for goods and services, they're paying their tuition, they're buying something, so on and so forth, okay? We're not directing those users to use their home computer. They are making that choice. The big difference is that if it's your business process, such as we are providing this kiosk for you, then something that you are using in your business process, or you're directing people forth, that's what falls in your cardholder data environment. Now, you need to be very careful. If you say, go to one of our labs and make your payments there, you now have pulled your lab into scope for PCI. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is, and we've talked a lot about it, a lot of it is education, is you can make that payment any place that you choose, on any device that you choose. You can do that from at home or any other place that you have internet connectivity with whatever device you want to use.
Thank you. Okay, quick question from someone regarding the categories is, why are load balancers not category 1?
Well, it would depend on how you're set up. We have some new lives, and here that's the load balancers that we are using. If you're also using the firewall capabilities for those, then yes, it would be. My best answer on that one is that if you can make it where you've got your data and it's that your load balancers are not behind your PCI firewall or firewalls, that would be the best thing. Because what happens with your load balancers, that means that you're going to have restricted access to those. You can't make changes or updates to those. Anything that could affect the security, that has to go through change management. When a security release is released from the vendor, you have 30 days to get that patch. It's also one of the things that you're going to have to run vulnerability scanning on, vulnerability monitoring. So if you can move that outside of that, so it's not behind the PCI firewall, that was going to be your best bet. Again, it kind of depends on how you're structuring that. And some of the things that we've looked at is, even though we'd like to virtualize some things, we've talked about moving some of the things off of so that they will not be on virtual because of the things that it's going to bring into scope.
Very good. Thank you. So one other question came in regarding the agreements that are needed from vendors that are processing. He asks, are you saying that we also need agreements with all vendors that are used to transmit cardholder data to our processor, i.e. our ISP and every ISP between the authorizer.net and our own network? Question mark.
Okay, so on that, no. This would be, because your ISP is not considered a service provider for you, this would be an application that you've purchased or somebody that's doing something for you in the cloud. Authorized.net, because they are a payment processor. PayPal, CashNet, Nelnet, all of those payment processors, you need to have those agreements in. Now we have several, they're wanting to take credit cards with IM leaks, which is for rec services. So that is a vendor that is providing a service for us, and they're using K-State's Merchant ID, and so that is an example of something that we would have to have a contractual agreement with, as far as or contract language in there about who's going to be responsible for what. So no, if it's just things that normally flow, if it doesn't have, so your ISP is an example of no, you wouldn't have to on that.
Thank you. We got feedback from a couple folks saying that the new Square readers are encrypted. And then at the time of the swipe, so that, I think kind of the message to take here is each situation is, and each product is somewhat unique. And these are questions to ask of whether it's a reader and an encryption service, or, as you look at how to implement and how to set things up, there's so much uniqueness as you go through this that there are things to check on as you go. I did have a question come in from someone on the transmission of card data being a little cloudy. Elizabeth, can you address transmission of card data just one more time for folks?
Okay, there's multiple ways that that can happen. Let's use the example of a card swipe. All PCI compliant card swipe machines, terminals, are encrypted. You don't have the ability to decrypt that. So whenever a person slides the credit card information, that information is encrypted, and so it goes from that device all the way out to the processor where it's decrypted. Okay? So that's kind of the transmission. Now, the one thing that I did find out, unfortunately, is that if you want, so you know how sometimes whenever you slide your card, it doesn't work, and so they have to key that in on the keypad? Those aren't encrypted. The cardholder data is not encrypted by the device. It only uses SSL, which is just the transport mechanism, out to the processor. So you have to purchase something additional for that. So it's basically your transport is however it's getting from point A to out to the processor. So that could be wireless, that could be your wired network, or the thing that I always love is the telephone, because the telephone, we don't have to do anything for that. So it's not, that infrastructure is not in scope. So whenever you slide, or even if they key in and it's an analog phone, I'm golden. I'm like, yes, this is good. But that is also another thing as we move more and more to VoIP. That is something that we do not allow, because of that pulls the network stuff into scope, and that's just another way that we really want to reduce the number of people that are doing transactions across our network, because of the intense work that it takes for that.
Great. Quick follow-up question on Square readers. If they're asking if they use a cellular iPad rather than wireless, and that is used for nothing else, would that be acceptable?
Very good question. And the answer is yes, it's dedicated. So the other thing is that the cellular network is currently exactly like the regular POTS, the regular phone lines. So yes, that's going across your network. It's not going across your network. It's going out through the cellular. In fact, that is what we put in as a solution for our parking garage. We basically said, we want you guys to use LTE, because then they own the equipment, you're their merchant ID, not using K-State's network in any way, shape, or form. And so that took us from being an SAQD to where all they have now are just analog card swipes. So that was a great win for that department.
Well, cool. And this is kind of a good follow-up question, the same kind of thing, asking what needs to be considered if you are using a compliant mobile device at a conference and plan to use the wireless network provided by the conference sponsor. So it sounds like they're taking payments on site at a conference. Would they be better off to use, instead of the conference wireless, would they be better off using a cellular access point?
We have our global campus does the exact same thing, and yes, there's a couple of options you can do there. You can either ask for a wired network, which in the hotels a lot of times that's a real pain for them to do. So a better thing would be to get one of the little cellular access points and use for that. That would be a much better way of doing it, because really, in all honesty, you don't have any idea about the infrastructure that's going at the hotel. In fact, one of our people was not traveling for work, and they were trying to use the wireless provided by the hotel, and it was having some problems. So he went down, and the guy said, "Oh, here's the password. Just go in there and see if you need anything to fix it." And so he fixed the wire network for the hotel. You really don't know. It's not something you should be trusting.
Very good. Are there any other questions, folks? So please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to address those. The Q&A will also copy up and make sure that that's part of our session archive as well. Do you have any other recommendations, Elizabeth, for them other than something like Square? I think you're on mute, Elizabeth. You're fine. You're unmute.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
One of the things that we do, that we have recommended to departments, is that they work with their acquiring bank and ask them what devices that they have. Like Bank of America is our acquiring bank, and so they have some devices. Now, at the time that we were talking to them, they hadn't been approved by the PCI Council, but a lot of institutions say, well, if our acquiring bank is providing this to us and we're paying them for this, we feel that the risk is acceptable. And a lot of it comes down to risk. There's the other thing that you can look at is they're kind of pricey, but the card swipes, they do have cellular for those. And then the market is shifting because the PCI Council is not keeping up with mobile. People expect to be able to make payments all the time, and Square has been enormously popular. So I think that there are other competitors out there to possibly look at. But I would go back to your acquiring bank.
Very good. Well, thank you. Well, as we don't have any additional questions, I think if Amanda, if you have any final thoughts, or Elizabeth, if you have any final thoughts or tips on what folks should do next, that would be a great way to wrap things up. I guess from my own perspective, while you guys think about that, I found I had to do three things, and one was to really understand who in my organization was taking payments and how they were taking and processing those transactions. And the second thing that I really felt like I needed to do was look at what policies and procedures were in place to manage that whole scope of work. And then the third thing was to really look at professional learning and training, and obviously the technical side, but also on the people side, how do we work together within the organization to make sure that we're PCI compliant. So those were three things that I immediately put on my radar to start working on. And what words of wisdom, Amanda?
I think we're still fairly new at this, but I think that there are a lot of great resources out there. So don't be afraid to ask questions, ask your peers. I know that I've used a lot of our region institutions for examples on things that they're doing and recommendations that they have done. So don't be afraid to ask questions, or if everybody's out there and we're all kind of going through the same thing. So don't be afraid to ask.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, do you have any final words of wisdom for folks?
What I would say is, this is from the business side, it really is a business issue, at least for most campuses. They need IT to help them with the technical or when they're dealing with vendors, but they're the ones that are agreeing to accept credit cards for the campus. And they're the ones that have the ability to withdraw that merchant ID or that, no, sorry, you can no longer accept credit cards. And so you really need to make this a partnership. And oftentimes, since it involves money, they're the ones that can really make sure that policies and procedures follow. And a lot of that stuff is already in place because of the cash and the checks and the things that are taking. And the other thing that I would say is people are doing things wrong. But it is amazing whenever you point out things, people immediately say, I had no idea. Tell me what it is that I need to do, and we will do it. And I would say that that is all across the board. People want to do the right thing. They want to do it for the place that they work, for the institution, whatever. And they also put themselves in the place of, hey, I've had I've seen the breaches. I've had to have my cards, get new cards, and I've been impacted by this. And they want to make sure that they, or the things that they're doing, don't make that happen for their institution or their organization. So the people, I've always noticed, they will work with you. They're just like, tell us what it is we need to do, and we'll be more than happy to comply.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. This last slide outlines some of the resources that we discussed through the presentation. And like I mentioned, we will put an archive and all the presentation materials up on the KanREN.net website so that you have access to them. And KanREN is committed to continuing to help members connect and help everyone connect beyond the connection. So we hope that this professional learning opportunity is something that you found helpful and that we can continue to grow on. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to more in the future. Thank you to Elizabeth and to Amanda. Please send them a thank you. And goodbye, everyone.